Go on a discovery cruise. Can you think of such a thing? That would be an imprudence I would not commit, even though the crew would allow me. I was on the point of exclaiming, and what if your brother and your countrymen have found refuge on some spot of the land that undoubtedly lies about us? But I restrained myself. Of what avail was it to reawaken our captain's grief? He, too, must have contemplated this eventuality, and he had not renounced his purpose of further search without being fully convinced of the folly of a last attempt. During those 3 days of fog, I had not caught sight of Dirk Peters, or rather he had made no attempt to approach, but had remained inflexibly at his post by the boat. Martin Holt's questions respecting his brother Ned seemed to indicate that his secret was known, at least in part, and the half-breed held himself more than ever aloof, sleeping while the others watched, and watching in their time of sleep. I even wondered whether he regretted having confided in me, and fancied that he had aroused my repugnance by his sad story. If so, he was mistaken. I deeply pitied the poor half-breed. Nothing could exceed the melancholy monotony of the hours which we passed in the midst of a fog so thick that the wind could not lift its curtain. The position of the iceberg could not be ascertained. It went with the current at a like speed, and had it been motionless there would have been no appreciable difference for us, for the wind had fallen, at least, so we supposed, and not a breath was stirring. The flame of a torch held up in the air did not flicker. The silence of space was broken only by the clangor of the seabirds, which came in muffled croaking tones through the stifling atmosphere of vapor. Petrels and albatross swept the top of the iceberg, where they kept a useless watch in their flight. In what direction were those swift-winged creatures? Perhaps already driven towards the confines of the Arctic region at the approach of winter bound. We could not tell. One day, the boatswain, who was determined to solve this question if possible, having mounted to the extreme top, not without risk of breaking his neck, came into such violent contact with a quebrantahuesos, a sort of gigantic petrel measuring 12 feet with spread wings, that he was flung on his back. "Curse the bird," he said on his return to the camp, addressing the observation to me. "I have had a narrow escape, a thump, and down I went, sprawling. I saved myself I don't know how, for I was all but over the side. Those ice ledges, slip through one's fingers like water. I called out to the bird, 'Can't you even look before you, you fool?' But what was the good of that? The big blunderer did not even beg my pardon." In the afternoon of the same day, our ears were assailed by a hideous braying from below. Hurlegerly remarked that as there were no asses to treat us to the concert, it must be given by penguins. Hitherto these countless dwellers in the polar regions had not thought proper to accompany us on our moving island. We had not seen even one, either at the foot of the iceberg or on the drifting packs. There could be no doubt that they were there in thousands, for the music was unmistakably that of a multitude of performers. Now those birds frequent by choice the edges of the coasts of islands and continents in high latitudes, or the ice fields in their neighborhood. Was not their presence an indication that land was near? I asked Captain Len Guy what he thought of the presence of these birds. "I think what you think, Mr. Georling," he replied. "Since we have been drifting, none of them have taken refuge on the iceberg, and here they are now in crowds, if we may judge by their deafening cries. From whence do they come? No doubt from land, which is probably near." "Is this West's opinion?" "Yes, Mr. Georling, and he is not given to vain imaginations." "Certainly not. And then another thing has struck both him and me, which has apparently escaped your attention. It is that the braying of the penguins is mingled with a sound like the lowing of cattle. Listen and you will readily distinguish it." I listened, and sure enough, the orchestra was more full than I had supposed. "I hear the lowing plainly," I said. "There are, then, seals and walrus also in the sea at the base." "That is certain, Mr. Georling, and I conclude from the fact that those animals, both birds and mammals, very rare since we left Sallel Island, frequent the waters into which the currents have carried us." "Of course, Captain, of course. Oh, what a misfortune it is that we should be surrounded by this impenetrable fog, which prevents us from even getting down to the base of the iceberg. There, no doubt, we should discover whether there are seaweed drifts around us. If that be so, it would be another sign." "Why not try, Captain?" No, Mr. Georling, that might lead to falls, and I will not permit anybody to leave the camp. If land be there, I imagine our iceberg will strike it before long." "And if it does not?" "If it does not, how are we to make it?" I thought to myself that the boat might very well be used in the latter case, but Captain Len Guy preferred to wait, and perhaps this was the wiser course under our circumstances. At 8 o'clock that evening, the half-condensed mist was so compact that it was difficult to walk through it. The composition of the air seemed to be changed, as though it were passing into a solid state. It was not possible to discern whether the fog had any effect upon the compass. I knew the matter had been studied by meteorologists, and that they believe they may safely affirm that the needle is not affected by this condition of the atmosphere. I will add here that since we had left the South Pole behind, no confidence could be placed in the indications of the compass. It had gone wild at the approach to the magnetic pole, to which we were no doubt on the way. Nothing could be known, therefore, concerning the course of the iceberg. The sun did not set quite below the horizon at this period, yet the waters were wrapped in tolerably deep darkness at 9 o'clock in the evening, when the muster of the crew took place. On this occasion, each man as usual answered to his name, except Dirk Peters. The call was repeated in the loudest of her legally stentorian tones. No reply. "Has nobody seen Dirk Peters during the day?" inquired the captain. "Nobody," answered the boatswain. "Can anything have happened to him?" "Don't be afraid," cried the boatswain. "Dirk Peters is in his element, and as much at his ease in the fog as a polar bear. He has got out of one bad scrape, he will get out of a second." I let her legally have his say, knowing well why the half-breed kept out of the way. That night none of us, I am sure, could sleep. We were smothered in the tents for lack of oxygen, and we were all more or less under the influence of a strange sort of presentiment, as though our fate were about to change, for better or worse, if indeed it could be worse. The night wore on without any alarm, and at 6 o'clock in the morning each of us came out to breathe a more wholesome air. The state of things was unchanged, the density of the fog was extraordinary. It was, however, found that the barometer had risen too quickly, it is true, for the rise to be serious. Presently other signs of change became evident. The wind, which was growing colder, a south wind since we had passed beyond the South Pole, began to blow a full gale, and the noises from below were heard more distinctly through the space swept by the atmospheric currents. At 9 o'clock the iceberg doffed its cap of vapor quite suddenly, producing an indescribable transformation scene which no fairy's wand could have accomplished in less time or with greater success. In a few moments, the sky was clear to the extreme verge of the horizon, and the sea reappeared, illumined by the oblique rays of the sun, which now rose only a few degrees above it. A rolling swell of the waves bathed the base of our iceberg in white foam, as it drifted, together with a great multitude of floating mountains under the double action of wind and current, on a course inclining to the northeast. "Land!" This cry came from the summit of the moving mountain, and Dirk Peters was revealed to our sight, standing on the outermost block, his hand stretched towards the north. The half-breed was not mistaken. The land this time, yes. It was land. Its distant heights of a blackish hue rose within 3 or 4 miles of us. 86 degrees 12, letter 2B9 south latitude. 114 degrees 17, letter 2B9 east longitude. The iceberg was nearly 4 degrees beyond the Antarctic pole, and from the western longitudes that our schooner had followed tracing the course of the Jane, we had passed into the eastern longitudes. Chapter 22. In camp. A little after noon, the iceberg was within a mile of the land. After their dinner, the crew climbed up to the topmost block, on which Dirk Peters was stationed. On our approach, the half-breed descended the opposite slope, and when I reached the top, he was no longer to be seen. The land on the north evidently formed a continent or island of considerable extent. On the west, there was a sharply projecting cape, surmounted by a sloping height which resembled an enormous seal's head on the side view. Then beyond that was a wide stretch of sea. On the east, the land was prolonged out of sight. Each one of us took in the position. It depended on the current, whether it would carry the iceberg into an eddy which might drive it on the coast, or continue to drift it towards the north. Which was the more admissible hypothesis? Captain Len Guy, west, her legally, and I talked over the matter, while the crew discussed it among themselves. Finally, it was agreed that the current tended rather to carry the iceberg towards the northern point of land. "After all," said Captain Len Guy, If it is habitable during the months of the summer season, it does not look like being inhabited, since we cannot descry a human being on the shore. Let us bear in mind, Captain, said I, that the iceberg is not calculated to attract attention as the Halbrane would have done. Evidently, Mr. Georling, and the natives, if there were any, would have been collected on the beach to see the Halbrane already. We must not conclude, Captain, because we do not see any natives. Certainly not, Mr. Georling, but you will agree with me that the aspect of this land is very unlike that of Sallel Island when the Jane reached it. There is nothing here but desolation and barrenness. I acknowledge that barrenness and desolation, that is all. Nevertheless, I want to ask you whether it is your intention to go ashore, Captain. With the boat. With the boat, should the current carry our iceberg away from the land. We have not an hour to lose, Mr. Georling, and the delay of a few hours might condemn us to a cruel winter stay, if we arrived too late at the iceberg barrier. And considering the distance, we are not too soon, observed West. I grant it, I replied, still persisting. But to leave this land behind us without ever having set foot on it, without having made sure that it does not preserve the traces of an encampment, if your brother, Captain, his companions. Captain Len Guy shook his head. How could the castaways have supported life in this desolate region for several months? Besides, the British flag was hoisted on the summit of the iceberg, and William Guy would have recognized it and come down to the shore had he been living. No one. At this moment, West, who had been observing certain points of approach, said, Let us wait a little before we come to a decision. In less than an hour we shall be able to decide. Our speed is slackening, it seems to me, and it is possible that an eddy may bring us back obliquely to the coast. That is my opinion too, said the boatswain, and if our floating machine is not stationary, it is nearly so. It seems to be turning round. West and Hurleygerly were not mistaken. For some reason or other, the iceberg was getting out of the course which it had followed continuously. A gyratory movement had succeeded to that of drifting, owing to the action of an eddy which set towards the coast. Besides, several ice mountains in front of us had just run aground on the edge of the shore. It was, then, useless to discuss whether we should take to the boat or not. According as we approached, the desolation of the land became more and more apparent, and the prospect of enduring 6 months, wintering there would have appalled the stoutest hearts. At 5 in the afternoon, the iceberg plunged into a deep rift in the coast ending in a long point on the right, and there stuck fast. On shore, burst from every man like a single exclamation, and the men were already hurrying down the slope of the iceberg when West commanded, Wait for orders. Some hesitation was shown, especially on the part of Hearn and several of his comrades. Then the instinct of discipline prevailed, and finally the whole crew ranged themselves around Captain Len Guy. It was not necessary to lower the boat, the iceberg being in contact with the point. The captain, the boatswain, and myself, preceding the others, were the first to quit the camp. Ours were the first human feet to tread this virgin and volcanic soil. We walked for 20 minutes on rough land, strewn with rocks of igneous origin, solidified lava, dusty slag, and gray ashes, but without enough clay to grow even the hardiest plants. With some risk and difficulty, Captain Len Guy, the boatswain, and I succeeded in climbing the hill. This exploit occupied a whole hour. Although evening had now come, it brought no darkness in its train. From the top of the hill we could see over an extent of from 30 to 40 miles, and this was what we saw. Behind us lay the open sea, laden with floating masses. A great number of these had recently heaped themselves up against the beach, and rendered it almost inaccessible. On the west was a strip of hilly land, which extended beyond our sight, and was washed on its east side by a boundless sea. It was evident that we had been carried by the drift through a strait. Ah, if we had only had our Halbrane! But our sole possession was a frail craft barely capable of containing a dozen men, and we were 23. There was nothing for it but to go down to the shore again, to carry the tents to the beach, and take measures in view of a winter sojourn under the terrible conditions imposed upon us by circumstances. On our return to the coast, the boatswain discovered several caverns in the granitic cliffs, sufficiently spacious to house us all and afford storage for the cargo of the Halbrane. Whatever might be our ultimate decision, we could not do better than place our material and install ourselves in this opportune shelter. After we had reascended the slopes of the iceberg and reached our camp, Captain Len Guy had the men mustered. The only missing man was Dirk Peters, who had decidedly isolated himself from the crew. There was nothing to fear from him, however. He would be with the faithful against the mutinous, and under all circumstances we might count upon him. When the circle had been formed, Captain Len Guy spoke, without allowing any sign of discouragement to appear, and explained the position with the utmost frankness and lucidity, stating in the first place that it was absolutely necessary to lower the cargo to the coast and stow it away in one of the caverns. Concerning the vital question of food, he stated that the supply of flour, preserved meat, and dried vegetables would suffice for the winter, however prolonged, and on that of fuel he was satisfied that we should not want for coal, provided it was not wasted, and it would be possible to economize it, as the hibernating waifs might brave the cold of the polar zone under a covering of snow and a roof of ice. Was the captain's tone of security feigned? I did not think so, especially as West approved of what he said. A third question raised by Hearn remained, and was well calculated to arouse jealousy and anger among the crew. It was the question of the use to be made of the only craft remaining to us. Ought the boat to be kept for the needs of our hibernation, or used to enable us to return to the iceberg barrier? Captain Len Guy would not pronounce upon this. He desired to postpone the decision for 24 or 48 hours. The boat, carrying the provisions necessary for such a voyage, could not accommodate more than 11, or, at the outside, 12 men. If the departure of the boat were agreed to, then its passengers must be selected by lot. The captain proceeded to state that neither West, the boatswain, nor he would claim any privilege, but would submit to the fortune of the lot with all the others. Both Martin Holt and Hardy were perfectly capable of taking the boat to the fishing grounds, where the whalers would still be found. Then, those to whom the lot should fall were not to forget their comrades, left to winter on the 86th parallel, and were to send a ship to take them off at the return of summer. All this was said in a tone as calm as it was firm. I must do Captain Len Guy the justice to say that he rose to the occasion. When he had concluded, without any interruption even from Hearn, no one made a remark. There was, indeed, none to be made, since, in the given case, lots were to be drawn under conditions of perfect equality. The hour of rest having arrived, each man entered the camp, partook of the supper prepared by Endicott, and went to sleep for the last time under the tents. Dirk Peters had not reappeared, and I sought for him in vain. On the following day, the 7th of February, everybody set to work early with a will. The boat was let down with all due precaution to the base of the iceberg, and drawn up by the men on a little sandy beach out of reach of the water. It was in perfectly good condition, and thoroughly serviceable. The boatswain then set to work on the former contents of the halbrane, furniture, bedding, sails, clothing, instruments, and utensils. Stowed away in a cabin, these things would no longer be exposed to the knocking about and damage of the iceberg. The cases containing preserved food and the casks of spirits were rapidly carried ashore. I worked with the captain and West at this onerous task, and Dirk Peters also turned up and lent the valuable assistance of his great strength, but he did not utter a word to anyone. Our occupation continued on the 8th, 9th, and February, and our task was finished in the afternoon of the 10th. The cargo was safely stowed in the interior of a large grotto, with access to it by a narrow opening. We were to inhabit the adjoining grotto, and Endicott set up his kitchen in the latter on the advice of the boatswain. Thus we should profit by the heat of the stove, which was to cook our food and warm the cavern during the long days, or rather the long nights of the austral winter. During the process of housing and storing, I observed nothing to arouse suspicion in the bearing of Hearn and the Falklands men. Nevertheless, the half-breed was kept on guard at the boat, which might easily have been seized upon the beach. Herr Legerly, who observed his comrades closely, appeared less anxious. On that same evening Captain Len Guy, having reassembled his people, stated that the question should be discussed on the morrow, adding that, if it were decided in the affirmative, lots should be drawn immediately. No reply was made. It was late and half dark outside, for at this date the sun was on the edge of the horizon and would very soon disappear below it. I had been asleep for some hours when I was awakened by a great shouting at a short distance. I sprang up instantly and darted out of the cavern, simultaneously with the captain and West, who had also been suddenly aroused from sleep. The boat, cried West. The boat was no longer in its place, that place so jealously guarded by Dirk Peters. After they had pushed the boat into the sea, 3 men had got into it with bales and casks, while 10 others strove to control the half-breed. Hearn was there and Martin Holt also. The latter, it seemed to me, was not interfering. These wretches, then, intended to depart before the lots were drawn. They meant to forsake us. They had succeeded in surprising Dirk Peters, and they would have killed him had he not fought hard for life. In the face of this mutiny, knowing our inferiority of numbers, and not knowing whether he might count on all the old crew, Captain Len Guy re-entered the cavern with West in order to procure arms. Hearn and his accomplices were armed. I was about to follow them, when the following words arrested my steps. The half-breed, overpowered by numbers, had been knocked down, and at this moment Martin Holt, in gratitude to the man who saved his life, was rushing to his aid, but Hearn called out to him, "Leave the fellow alone and come with us." Martin Holt hesitated. "Yes, leave him alone, I say. Leave Dirk Peters, the assassin of your brother, alone." "The assassin of my brother." "Your brother, killed on board the Grampus." "Killed by Dirk Peters." "Yes, killed and eaten," repeated Hearn, who pronounced the hateful words with a kind of howl. And then, at a sign from Hearn, 2 of his comrades seized Martin Holt and dragged him into the boat. Hearn was instantly followed by all those whom he had induced to join in this criminal deed. At that moment, Dirk Peters rose from the ground and sprang upon one of the Falklands men as he was in the act of stepping on the platform of the boat, lifted him up bodily, hurled him round his head, and dashed his brains out against a rock. In an instant the half-breed fell, shot in the shoulder by a bullet from Hearn's pistol, and the boat was pushed off. Then Captain Len Guy and West came out of the cavern. The whole scene had passed in less than a minute, and ran down to the point, which they reached together with the boatswain, Hardy, Francis, and Stern. The boat, which was drawn by the current, was already some distance off, and the tide was falling rapidly. West shouldered his gun and fired. A sailor dropped into the bottom of the boat. A second shot, fired by Captain Len Guy, grazed Hearn's breast, and the ball was lost among the ice blocks at the moment when the boat disappeared behind the iceberg. The only thing for us to do was to cross to the other side of the point. The current would carry the wretches thither, no doubt, before it bore them northward. If they passed within range, and if a second shot should hit Hearn, either killing or wounding him, his companions might perhaps decide on coming back to us. A quarter of an hour elapsed. When the boat appeared at the other side of the point, it was so far off that our bullets could not reach it. Hearn had already had the sail set, and the boat, impelled by wind and current jointly, was soon no more than a white speck on the face of the waters, and speedily disappeared. Chapter 23. Found at last. The question of our wintering on the land whereon we had been thrown was settled for us. But after all, the situation was not changed for those among the 9, now only remaining of the 23, who should not have drawn the lot of departure. Who could speculate upon the chances of the whole 9, might not all of them have drawn the lot of stay? And when every chance was fully weighed, was that of those who had left us the best? To this question there could be no answer. When the boat had disappeared, Captain Len Guy and his companions retraced their steps towards the cavern in which we must live for all the time during which we could not go out, in the dread darkness of the Antarctic winter. My first thought was of Dirk Peters, who, being wounded, could not follow us when we hurried to the other side of the point. On reaching the cavern, I failed to find the half-breed. Was he severely wounded? Should we have to mourn the death of this man, who was as faithful to us as to his poor Pym? "Let us search for him, Mr. Georling," cried the boatswain. "We will go together," said the captain. "Dirk Peters would never have forsaken us, and we will not forsake him." "Would he come back," said I, "now that what he thought was known to him and me only has come out?" I informed my companions of the reason why the name of Ned Holt had been changed to that of Parker in Arthur Pym's narrative, and of the circumstances under which the half-breed had apprised me of the fact. At the same time, I urged every consideration that might exculpate him, dwelling in particular upon the point that if the lot had fallen to Dirk Peters, he would have been the victim of the other's hunger. Dirk Peters confided this secret to you only, inquired Captain Len Guy. To me only, Captain. And you have kept it? Absolutely. Then I cannot understand how it came to the knowledge of Hearn. At first, I replied, I thought Hearn might have talked in his sleep, and that it was by chance Martin Holt learned the secret. After reflection, however, I recalled to mind that when the half-breed related the scene on the Grampus to me, he was in my cabin and the side sash was raised. I have reason to think that the man at the wheel overheard our conversation. Now that man was Hearn, who, in order to hear it more clearly, let go the wheel so that the Halbrane lurched. I remember, said West. I questioned the fellow sharply and sent him down into the hold. Well then, Captain, I resumed, it was from that day that Hearn made up to Martin Holt. Hurley eagerly called my attention to the fact. Of course he did, said the boatswain, for Hearn, not being capable of managing the boat which he intended to seize, required a master-hand like Holt. And so, I said, he kept on urging Holt to question the half-breed concerning his brother's fate, and you know how Holt came at last to learn the fearful truth. Martin Holt seemed to be stupefied by the revelation. The others dragged him away, and now he is with them. We were all agreed that things had happened as I supposed, and now the question was, did Dirk Peters, in his present state of mind, mean to absent himself? Would he consent to resume his place among us? We all left the cavern, and after an hour's search we came in sight of Dirk Peters, whose first impulse was to escape from us. At length, however, Hurley and Francis came up with him. He stood still and made no resistance. I advanced and spoke to him, the others did the same. Captain Len Guy offered him his hand, which he took after a moment's hesitation. Then, without uttering a single word, he returned towards the beach. From that day no allusion was ever made to the tragic story of the Grampus. Dirk Peters' wound proved to be slight. He merely wrapped a piece of sailcloth round the injured arm and went off to his work with entire unconcern. We made all the preparation in our power for a prolonged hibernation. Winter was threatening us. For some days past the sun hardly showed at all through the mists. The temperature fell to 36 degrees and would rise no more, while the solar rays, casting shadows of endless length upon the soil, gave hardly any heat. The captain made us put on warm woolen clothes without waiting for the cold to become more severe. Icebergs, packs, streams, and drifts came in greater numbers from the south. Some of these struck and stayed upon the coast, which was already heaped up with ice, but the greater number disappeared in the direction of the northeast. All these pieces, said the boatswain, will go to the closing up of the iceberg wall. If Hearn and his lot of scoundrels are not ahead of them, I imagine they will find the door shut, and as they have no key to open it with. I suppose you think, boatswain, that our case is less desperate than theirs. I do think so, Mr. Georling, and I have always thought so. If everything had been done as it was settled, and the lot had fallen to me to go with the boat, I would have given up my turn to one of the others. After all, there is something in feeling dry ground under your feet. I don't wish the death of anybody, but if Hearn and his friends do not succeed in clearing the iceberg barrier, if they are doomed to pass the winter on the ice, reduced for food to a supply that will only last a few weeks, you know the fate that awaits them. Yes, a fate worse than ours. And besides, said the boatswain, even supposing they do reach the Antarctic Circle, if the whalers have already left the fishing grounds, it is not a laden and overladen craft that will keep the sea until the Australian coasts are in sight. This was my own opinion, and also that of the captain and West. During the following 4 days, we completed the storage of the whole of our belongings, and made some excursions into the interior of the country, finding all barren, and not a trace that any landing had ever been made there. One day, Captain Len Guy proposed that we should give a geographical name to the region whither the iceberg had carried us. It was named Halbrane Land, in memory of our schooner, and we called the strait that separated the two parts of the polar continent the Jane Sound. Then we took to shooting the penguins which swarmed upon the rocks, and to capturing some of the amphibious animals which frequented the beach. We began to feel the want of fresh meat, and Endicott's cooking rendered seal and walrus flesh quite palatable. Besides, the fat of these creatures would serve, at need, to warm the cavern and feed the cooking stove. Our most formidable enemy would be the cold, and we must fight it by every means within our power. It remained to be seen whether the amphibia would not forsake Halbrane Land at the approach of winter, and seek a less rigorous climate in lower latitudes. Fortunately, there were hundreds of other animals to secure our little company from hunger, and even from thirst, at need. The beach was the home of numbers of Galapagos, a kind of turtle so called from an archipelago in the equinoctial sea, where also they abound, and mentioned by Arthur Pym as supplying food to the islanders. It will be remembered that Pym and Peters found 3 of these Galapagos in the native boat, which carried them away from Sallal Island. The movement of these huge creatures is slow, heavy, and waddling. They have thin necks 2 feet long, triangular snake-like heads, and can go without food for very long periods. Arthur Pym has compared the Antarctic turtles to dromedaries because, like those ruminants, they have a pouch just where the neck begins, which contains from 2 to 3 gallons of cold, fresh water. He relates, before the scene of the lot drawing, that but for one of these turtles, the shipwrecked crew of the Grampus must have died of hunger and thirst. If Pym is to be believed, some of the great turtles weigh from 12 to 1,500 pounds. Those of Halbrane Land did not go beyond 700 or 800 pounds, but their flesh was none the less savory. On the 19th of February, an incident occurred, an incident which those who acknowledge the intervention of Providence in human affairs will recognize as providential. It was 8 o'clock in the morning, the weather was calm, the sky was tolerably clear, the thermometer stood at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. We were assembled in the cavern, with the exception of the boatswain, waiting for our breakfast, which Endicott was preparing, and were about to take our places at table, when we heard a call from outside. The voice was Hurliguerly's, and we hurried out. On seeing us, he cried, "Come, come quickly!" He was standing on a rock at the foot of the hillock above the beach in which Halbrane Land ended beyond the point, and his right hand was stretched out towards the sea. "What is it?" asked Captain Len Guy. "A boat." "Is it the Halbrane's boat coming back?" "No, Captain, it is not." Then we perceived a boat, not to be mistaken for that of our schooner in form or dimensions, drifting without oars or paddle, seemingly abandoned to the current. We had but one idea in common, to seize at any cost upon this derelict craft, which would, perhaps, prove our salvation. But how were we to reach it? How were we to get it in to the point of Halbrane Land? While we were looking distractedly at the boat, and at each other, there came a sudden splash at the end of the hillock, as though a body had fallen into the sea. It was Dirk Peters, who, having flung off his clothes, had sprung from the top of a rock, and was swimming rapidly towards the boat before we made him out. We cheered him heartily. I never beheld anything like that swimming. He bounded through the waves like a porpoise, and indeed he possessed the strength and swiftness of one. What might not be expected of such a man? In a few minutes the half-breed had swum several cables, lengths towards the boat in an oblique direction. We could only see his head like a black speck on the surface of the rolling waves. A period of suspense, of intense watching of the brave swimmer succeeded. Surely he would reach the boat, but must he not be carried away with it? Was it to be believed that even his great strength would enable him, swimming, to tow it to the beach? After all, why should there not be oars in the boat? Said the boatswain. William Guy. William Guy. He has it, hurrah Dirk hurrah, shouted Hurliguerly, and Endicott echoed his exultant cheer. The half-breed had, in fact, reached the boat and raised himself alongside half out of the water. His big, strong hand grasped the side, and at the risk of causing the boat to capsize, he hoisted himself up to the side, stepped over it, and sat down to draw his breath. Almost instantly a shout reached our ears. It was uttered by Dirk Peters. What had he found? Paddles. It must be so, for we saw him seat himself in the front of the boat and paddle with all his strength in striving to get out of the current. "Come along," said the captain, and turning the base of the hillock, we all ran along the edge of the beach between the blackish stones that bestrewed it. After some time, West stopped us. The boat had reached the shelter of a small projection at that place, and it was evident that it would be run ashore there. When it was within 5 or 6 cables' lengths, and the eddy was helping it on, Dirk Peters let go the paddles, stooped towards the after part of the boat, and then raised himself, holding up an inert body. An agonized cry from Captain Len Guy rent the air. My brother, my brother. He is living, shouted Dirk Peters. A moment later, the boat had touched the beach, and Captain Len Guy held his brother in his arms. 3 of William Guy's companions lay apparently lifeless in the bottom of the boat. And these 4 men were all that remained of the crew of the Jane. Chapter 24. 11 years in a few pages. The heading of the following chapter indicates that the adventures of William Guy and his companions after the destruction of the English schooner, and the details of their history subsequent to the departure of Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters, are about to be narrated with all possible brevity. We carried our treasure trove to the cavern and had the happiness of restoring all 4 men to life. In reality, it was hunger, nothing but hunger, which had reduced the poor fellows to the semblance of death. On the 8th of February, 1828, the crew of the Jane, having no reason to doubt the good faith of the population of Sallel Island, or that of their chief, Too-wit, disembarked, in order to visit the village of Clock Clock, having previously put the schooner into a state of defense, leaving 6 men on board. The crew, counting William Guy, the captain, Arthur Pym, and Dirk Peters, formed a body of 32 men, armed with guns, pistols, and knives. The dog Tiger accompanied them. On reaching the narrow gorge leading to the village, preceded and followed by the numerous warriors of Too-wit, the little company divided, Arthur Pym, Dirk Peters, and Allen, the sailor, entering a cleft in the hillside with the intention of crossing it to the other side. From that moment their companions were never to see them more. After a short interval a shock was felt. The opposite hill fell down in a vast heap, burying William Guy and his 28 companions. 22 of these unfortunate men were crushed to death on the instant, and their bodies would never be found under that mass of earth. 7, miraculously sheltered in the depth of a great cleft of the hill, had survived the catastrophe. These were William Guy, Patterson, Roberts, Coven, Trinkle, also Forbes and Sexton, since dead. As for Tiger, they knew not whether he had perished in the landslip, or whether he had escaped. There existed in the right side of the hill, as well as in the left, on either side of the fissure, certain winding passages, and it was by crawling along these in the darkness that William Guy, Patterson, and the others reached a cavity which let in light and air in abundance. From this shelter they beheld the attack on the Jane by 60 pirogues, the defense made by the 6 men on board, the invasion of the ship by the savages, and finally, the explosion which caused the death of a vast number of natives, as well as the complete destruction of the ship. Too-wit and the Sallel Islanders were at first terrified by the effects of this explosion, but probably still more disappointed. Their instincts of pillage could not be gratified, because some valueless wreckage was all that remained of the ship and her cargo, and they had no reason to suppose that any of the crew had survived the cleverly contrived collapse of the hill. Hence it came about that Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters on the one side, and William Guy and his companions on the other, were enabled to remain undisturbed in the labyrinths of Clock Clock, where they fed on the flesh of bitterns. These they could catch with their hands, and the fruit of the nut trees which grow on the hillsides. They procured fire by rubbing pieces of soft against pieces of hard wood. There was a quantity of both within their reach. After a whole week of this confinement, Arthur Pym and the half-breed had succeeded, as we know, in leaving their hiding place, securing a boat, and abandoning Sallel Island. But William Guy and his companions had not yet found an opportunity to escape. After they had been shut up in the labyrinth for 21 days, the birds on which they lived began to fail them, and they recognized that their only means of escaping hunger. They had not to fear thirst, for there was a spring of fresh water in the interior of the hill, was to go down again to the coast, lay hands upon a native boat, and get out to sea. Where were the fugitives to go, and what was to become of them without provisions? These were questions that had to be asked, and which nobody could answer. Nevertheless, they would not have hesitated to attempt the adventure if they could have a few hours of darkness. But at that time of year, the sun did not as yet go down behind the horizon of the 84th parallel. Death would probably have put an end to their misery, had not the situation been changed by the following events. On the 22nd of February, in the morning, William Guy and Patterson were talking together, in terrible perplexity of mind, at the orifice of the cavity that opened upon the country. They no longer knew how to provide for the wants of 7 persons, who were then reduced to eating nuts only, and were suffering in consequence from severe pain in the head and stomach. They could see big turtles crawling on the beach, but how could they venture to go thither, with hundreds of natives coming and going about their several occupations, with their constant cry of tekelilai. Suddenly, this crowd of people became violently agitated. Men, women, and children ran wildly about on every side. Some of the savages even took to their boats as though a great danger were at hand. What was happening? William Guy and his companions were very soon informed. The cause of the tumult was the appearance of an unknown animal, a terrible quadruped, which dashed into the midst of the islanders, snapping at and biting them indiscriminately, as it sprang at their throats with a hoarse growling. And yet the infuriated animal was alone, and might easily have been killed by stones or arrows. Why then did a crowd of savages manifest such abject terror? Why did they take to flight? Why did they appear incapable of defending themselves against this one beast? The animal was white, and the sight of it had produced the phenomenon previously observed, that inexplicable terror of whiteness common to all the natives of Tsalal. To their extreme surprise, William Guy and his companions recognized the strange animal as the dog Tiger. Yes, Tiger had escaped from the crumbling mass of the hill and betaken himself to the interior of the island, whence he had returned to Klock Klock, to spread terror among the natives. But Tiger was no mere phantom foe. He was the most dangerous and deadly of enemies, for the poor animal was mad, and his fangs were fatal. This was the reason why the greater part of the Tsalal Islanders took to flight, headed by their chief, Too-Wit, and the Wampos, who are the leading personages of Klock Klock. It was under these extraordinary circumstances that they abandoned their island, whither they were destined never to return. Although the boats carried off the bulk of the population, a considerable number still remained on Tsalal, having no means of escape, and their fate accomplished itself quickly. Several natives who were bitten by Tiger developed hydrophobia rapidly and attacked the others. Fearful scenes ensued, and are briefly to be summed up in one dismal statement. The bones we had seen in or near Klock Klock were those of the poor savages, which had lain there bleaching for 11 years. The poor dog had died, after he had done his fell work, in a corner on the beach, where Dirk Peters found his skeleton and the collar bearing the name of Arthur Pym. Then, after those natives who could not escape from the island had all perished in the manner described, William Guy, Patterson, Trinkle, Coven, Forbes, and Sexton ventured to come out of the labyrinth, where they were on the verge of death by starvation. What sort of existence was that of the 7 survivors of the expedition during the 11 ensuing years? On the whole, it was more endurable than might have been supposed. The natural products of an extremely fertile soil and the presence of a certain number of domestic animals secured them against want of food. They had only to make out the best shelter for themselves they could contrive, and wait for an opportunity of getting away from the island with as much patience as might be granted to them. And from whence could such an opportunity come? Only from one of the chances within the resources of Providence. Captain William Guy, Patterson, and their 5 companions descended the ravine, which was half filled with the fallen masses of the hill face, amid heaps of scoria and blocks of black granite. Before they left this gorge, it occurred to William Guy to explore the fissure on the right into which Arthur Pym, Dirk Peters, and Allen had turned, but he found it blocked up. It was impossible for him to get into the pass. Thus he remained in ignorance of the existence of the natural or artificial labyrinth, which corresponded with the one he had just left, and probably communicated with it under the dry bed of the torrent. The little company, having passed the chaotic barrier that intercepted the northern route, proceeded rapidly towards the northwest. There, on the coast, at about 3 miles from Klock Klock, they established themselves in a grotto very like that in our own occupation on the coast of Halbrane Land. And it was in this place that, during long, hopeless years, the 7 survivors of the Jane lived, as we were about to do ourselves, but under better conditions, for the fertility of the soil of Tsalal furnished them with resources unknown in Halbrane Land. In reality, we were condemned to perish when our provisions should be exhausted, but they could have waited indefinitely, and they did wait. They had never entertained any doubt that Arthur Pym, Dirk Peters, and Allen had perished, and this was only too true in Allen's case. How, indeed, could they ever have imagined that Pym and the half-breed had got hold of a boat and made their escape from Tsalal Island? So then, as William Guy told us, not an incident occurred to break the monotony of that existence of 11 years, not even the reappearance of the islanders, who were kept away from Tsalal by superstitious terror. No danger had threatened them during all that time, but of course, as it became more and more prolonged, they lost the hope of ever being rescued. At first, with the return of the fine season, when the sea was once more open, they had thought it possible that a ship would be sent in search of the Jane. But after 4 or 5 years, they relinquished all hope.